Today, I'm going to be talking about some preliminary research that we're collecting right now in my lab. It's not something I've been doing for a decade, so it's relatively new data, and we're still thinking about different ways to interpret it. And I'm excited to share it with you for feedback and suggestions, and I would love to hear it all at the end. The title of my talk is The Roles of Selective Attention in Speech Comprehension and Aphasia Rehabilitation. I certainly don't have all the answers, but this is the direction that we're looking at in my lab currently. And I'd like to point out my really nice lab logo there. We're the Sun Devils at ASU, so I have a devil. The logo police haven't taken away from me yet at ASU. The big question of my research and why I'm kind of going in this direction is I want to know, what are the normal neural resources that contribute to speech comprehension in everyday life? In everyday life, we don't have headphones on and we're not listening to vowels, or something. Obviously, for research purposes, those things are very interesting and important. But I'm also interested in sort of the complexity of comprehension in a setting like this, where you have multiple distractors and multiple things you could be paying attention to, and those things will change rapidly over time. And then, of course, what I really care about is how does this change after brain injury? How can we help individuals navigate communication and navigate speech comprehension in sort of everyday life situations? And again, my main focus is using that information to improve things for individuals with aphasia. And I'm also really interested in how a lot of other factors that we don't always take into account affect this relationship. One thing is aging. We know that the majority of strokes happen in older adults. So how does age-related brain changes factor into speech comprehension resources that are available to our stroke patients? Also, things like hearing loss. There's age-related, just normal, high-frequency hearing loss, as well as hearing loss that may occur because of the stroke or other injury. And also, of course, as we all know, language is not occurring in a vacuum. There's lots of cognitive resources that we can recruit to help us process language, especially when language is hard due to brain injury or environment. And so I'm really interested in how these all interplay with one another. Just to give you a quick idea of what I'll be talking about, so if you get bored, you'll know we're moving along soon. I will briefly talk about why it might be important to study selective attention in aphasia. And then I'll present a series of experiments in neurotypical older adults, whatever that means, but I'll talk about that. Looking at some resting state fMRI data, as well as some behavioral measures of looking at cognitive factors involved in sentence comprehension. This work, I talk about it, like I did it all, but of course that's absolutely not true. It's the brainchild of my Ph.D. student, Megan Fitzhugh, and this is her work. And then we'll move into aphasia and talk about some different measures of selective attention that we've been examining in our aphasia cohort, and looking at how that maps onto their comprehension abilities. And this work is done by Ariana LaCroix, one of my other PhD students. And she's also has some really interesting preliminary findings that I'll present, and they're, again, very preliminary, but looking at how prosody of the speech that individuals are comprehending, how that can help or inhibit comprehension based on people's selective attention and other cognitive abilities. And then we'll wrap it up. So why do I study speech comprehension? I'm speaking to C-STAR, so obviously this is of value, and clearly speech production is extremely important for communication, right? That's a given. So I'm just advocating for also studying speech comprehension as an important rehab avenue. And that's because we know that speech comprehension is a top predictor of communication abilities, particularly after a brain injury. And there's, in addition to people diagnosed with aphasia, there's also many individuals with a stroke that score not clinically, they score within normal ranges on aphasia batteries, but yet they still report communication difficulties in everyday life situations. So although they do okay in a clinical, room, one-on-one type assessment setting, they're still having difficulties when things get basically difficult in everyday life. And then even just backing up a step, we also need to look at older adults. As I mentioned, I think it's 75% of strokes occur in older adults, I think 60, 65 ages and older. And there's also the fact that these strokes occur in older adults, and about a third of older adults experience conversation, speech comprehension difficulties, and they're often not corrected just by a hearing aid. That might improve some, but it's not just a amplification issue. And we know that these hearing and communication difficulties in older adults are also known to be correlated with isolation, susceptibility to fraud, and lots of other sort of social problems. So in order to really help individuals with aphasia, I would argue that we also really need to understand older adult speech comprehension processing as well. When we think about the brain and language, of course, everyone's familiar with a dorsal ventral type model of speech processing. I was in Greg Hickok's labs. I could probably draw this from memory with exact arrows, perfectly done. But what I want to point out is that in addition to these typical language regions that we're interested in, there's lots of other networks in the brain, right? And I'm particularly interested in these intrinsic networks that we know they're involved in a variety of cognitive functions. For example, there's a lot going on here, but for example, the cingulo-opercular network and the frontoparietal network are two known intrinsic networks that are involved in several cognitive functions that we'll talk about in a minute. And it probably doesn't take a neuroanatomist to look at, for example, a snapshot of the dorsal ventral model of speech and look at these other networks and to know that there's highly, neuroanatomical overlap, at least at a gross level, of these different networks. And so how does the speech processing network that we all study and we know is critical, how is that network interacting with these other cognitive networks that we know exist? Okay. And in particular, I kind of use the term selective attention, but there's lots of ways to define selective attention, and I don't think it's really all that important for this talk. So I just want to let you know how I think of it. And it's really just paying attention to the right information at the right time. And this involves a bunch of different steps, right? You have to inhibit information that's not helpful. There might be some automatic inclinations that you might have to override. You also have to do something with interfering information and resolve that. And so all of these processes are, we know in other domains, are supported by a lot of these resting state networks, particularly the cingulo-opercular and frontoparietal networks that, again, have a lot of neuroanatomy very nearby these language centers and can be lesioned in aphasia. I'm particularly interested in these two networks because of their relation and their connectivity to language networks. So we know, for example, the frontoparietal network is involved in the selection of relevant information in a variety of modalities and a variety of tasks or contexts or different types of group of people, that this network is critical for that. And again, that's one aspect of selective attention that I'm interested in. We also know, this is just from our own data and in older adults, but many other people have shown this, is that the frontoparietal network is highly connected to the traditional language network. Now, obviously, language is not just processed in like 2 or 4 little nodes in the brain, but just for demonstration purposes, I have a language network here. It's the posterior STG and bilateral inferior frontal gyrus. And again, that's not like where language resides, but it's just for demonstration purposes, that this frontoparietal network is highly connected with known language regions. And we also know from previous work that with greater connectivity of the frontoparietal network and greater activation, we see improved sentence comprehension in individuals with aphasia. So we know that this network is interacting with typical language regions, and it's helpful for individuals with aphasia. The other network I often focus on is called the cingulo-opercular network. And this network is involved in other elements of what I would call selective attention. For example, sustaining alertness and vigilance, being ready to attend to the right information. If you're not alert, it's difficult to attend to something. And this network is also highly connected with what we could define as a language network. And it's also important, I know if you're here, you can't see this, but Ken Baden's work and many others have shown that activation of the cingulo-opercular network improves single word comprehension and learning. So we know that these things are working together. And that was in control subjects. The idea of looking at sentence selective attention and aphasia is not my idea. Swathi Kiran and others have looked at how attention can affect a variety of factors that affect individuals with aphasia. I would probably say that most of the work in this diagram has focused on memory, particularly working memory in aphasia. And a lot of my work has focused on that. So there's nothing wrong with that. but I'm interested in perhaps, other avenues of these cognitive functions affecting aphasia, not just sort of via, working memory. And so I'm sort of more looking at the sort of executive function side, and particularly selective attention. The research in selective attention and aphasia outcomes, particularly regarding comprehension after stroke, are somewhat mixed. So there is research showing that there's better improved speech comprehension if these selective attention networks are activated. The more they're activated, the better their comprehension. But there's also a really large literature, there's just a few examples cited there, showing that there's significant inter-subject and intra-subject across testing session variability, not just in selective attention and comprehension performance, but also amongst the relationship between the two. So there's not really a great consensus of how these things are related and how we can use this information to help individuals. So why is it kind of unclear what's going on? Well, as we all know in this room and online, aphasia is a complex disorder with many different mechanisms that can affect outcomes. But even just looking at a more sort of simpler view of it first, just looking at the different tasks that are being used. One thing that comes to my mind is modality. Most of the selective attention paradigms that we have, both experimentally as well as clinically, are typically in the visual domain or a combination of auditory and visual information. So maybe different types of modalities engage different selective attention resources, and that might affect, how it's related to aphasia. Also, we know from a variety of studies that there's different types of selective attention. It's not just one mechanism. And another thing is looking at what type of speech comprehension measures you're looking at. Are you looking at, syllables, single words, or sentences? So there's some variability there too that, probably comes into play. And then, of course, some of the sort of personal factors or individual factors that I'm interested in is with participants. How does aging affect these results? What about hearing loss? What about other cognitive abilities? What about memory and other executive functions? How does that play into the relationship between selective attention and speech comprehension? So our approach that I'll be talking about today uses the dependent variable for the most part as sentence comprehension. So obviously there's clearly important reasons to look at speech processing at every level. And here we're just looking at sort of the, not discourse, but larger level than single words in sentence comprehension. And the data I'll show today is a sentence picture matching task developed by Stephen Wilson that we've just slightly modified. And my approach here is really just sort of a multi-prong approach. We want to use multiple resources, multiple measures of selective attention and other functions, and present them in multiple modalities, both the visual and auditory modalities. For selective attention, we have a variety of tasks that I'll show results from. But just to give you an idea, the attention network test, classic Stroop tasks, as well as some clinical measures. And then also, because of the long history of studying working memory and sentence comprehension, to sort of compare to our selective attention data, we also have a variety of measures of working memory. And here I'm kind of combining short-term and working memory, as some of the measures load more onto one factor or another. But for the purposes here, they're not selective attention per se. And then also the brain data I'll be showing to you is mostly from resting state fMRI studies. And the idea is that we can locate at rest, so the subjects aren't doing anything in the scanner other than hopefully relaxing. We can identify intrinsic connectivity between certain brain areas, and then we will infer how that connectivity might relate to behavioral measures outside of the scanner. And then in all of our models, we're throwing in, or we have potential covariates if they correlate with our DB for age, hearing loss, processing speed, and just sort of how quickly someone can make a response. Obviously would matter in, say, reaction time tasks. And then also, of course, single word comprehension. We're looking at sentence comprehension, and we're sort of interested in that sort of level of complexity. So we're controlling for basic lexical semantic abilities. So first, as I mentioned, we'll talk about some older adult work, again, led by my grad student, Megan Fitzhugh. She's on the job market, by the way. We know that older adults can have difficulties comprehending sentences in noisy environments. This has been shown by many people. Here's just some data of mine. These are neurotypical older adults. And what I would like to show here is that we have proportion, just accuracy on the y-axis, that for simple sentences, those canonical sentences there on the left are very simple, active sentences. You know, neurotypical older adults are at ceiling, and you know, it's fine. You can put them in just normal silence and quiet, or you can present the sentences in like a multi-speaker background noise. It's probably taxing their selective attention, and they still do quite well. Most perform near ceiling. But then when you make the sentences more difficult, a variety of non-canonical structures will do this. We use object-relative sentences here. You can see a drop in performance only for the task where selective attention is being engaged in that multi-speaker talker background. Babble would be a short term for the background noise. And we see the same thing in reaction time. There's no difference between the selective attention conditions of silence or the multi-speaker background for the simple sentences, but when things get hard, we see the separation. And our hypothesis is that, you know, reasonably so, is that selective attentional resources are being saturated, and they're also used in sentence comprehension. So that's why you see that dip in performance. And we also know this because now we can add in this gray bar, which is just a background white noise or broadband noise. And so when you do sentence comprehension, this, you know, shh type noise, instead of multi-talkers speaking at you, there's not a significant difference. So we see the drop between the orange and the gray, and the gray and the blue perform similarly, which is silence and the broadband background noise. But that dip in performance happens when you add in that additional attention information, those additional talkers in the background. So what we want to know is that these selective attention and language processing seem to be interacting. So how do they interact in the brain? What does this look like? And then, of course, how is that related to what we really care about, which is these sentence comprehension abilities? So I'm going to present to you kind of a series of resting state fMRI findings. Sort of the first thing we did as sort of a sanity check, but also the fact that it was not done before to our knowledge, is we kind of did something very simple, which is just took Heschl's gyrus as a region of interest and then said, which of these selective attention cognitive networks are we connected to? Okay, and not shockingly, probably, but it was good to quantify this, and this is in our 30 older adults, that, for example, left Heschl's gyrus is significantly connected to, of course, language processing regions, but as well as our cingulo-opercular network and other selective attention networks that are engaged in selective attention. And these are, you know, positively connected. And the right hemisphere has a slightly different pattern, but nonetheless also is highly connected to these selective attention networks that we're interested in. Okay, so that's cool. So the first variable we wanted to think about with this connectivity is how does this connectivity change with hearing loss? So how is this connectivity you know, predicted by hearing loss? And interestingly, we don't see any differences in left Heschl's gyrus connectivity as a function of hearing loss. In this case, we quantified hearing loss as a pure tone threshold average. Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, is it structural or functional?
Functional. Yeah, so it's, my apologies if that wasn't clear. It's resting state functional MRI connectivity. And what we see with right Heschl's, so we don't see anything in left Heschl's gyrus in terms of connections that are correlated with hearing loss. But what we see in hearing loss is in the right Heschl's gyrus, with hearing loss, stronger connectivity to language regions as well as the cingulo-opercular network. And we sort of see this as possibly some sort of compensation mechanism. With hearing loss, your auditory and language areas need to talk more with these attention networks to, you know, be adequate. So again, increased connectivity with these networks with hearing loss. And then also, of course, beyond Heschl's gyrus, how does that language and these attention networks change with hearing loss? Not worrying about if Heschl's gyrus is connected or not. And we see a couple interesting patterns here. We see increased connectivity between the cingulo-opercular network and another intrinsic network, the default mode network. But we also see, as well as language frontoparietal, but we also see decreased connectivity between the frontoparietal and another attention network, the dorsal attention network. So we see that with hearing loss, some of these cognitive networks are more strongly connected, but others show a decline in connectivity. So there are hearing loss related changes in how these selective attention networks work with language and auditory regions. So that's something to consider in our work. But we also want to know, once you control for these hearing loss effects, then how are these networks involved predicting sentence comprehension abilities? So the next data, we covary out hearing loss abilities and then see what connectivity trends remain. And so the short answer is yes, connectivity does predict speech comprehension abilities once hearing is controlled for. And what we see is that greater connectivity between the posterior STG bilaterally and this frontoparietal network that we're interested in, stronger connectivity predicts greater speech comprehension abilities once hearing abilities are controlled for. I will just show the next slide is a graph of, just for example, the connectivity between the left posterior superior temporal gyrus and left parietal cortex. Sorry about that. And so again, this is just one example from that wheel of connectivity there. But again, this is better comprehension. So greater connectivity between this sort of language area and these selective attention networks equals better sentence comprehension for these older adults. So that was really interesting. And then we also wanted to look at this in a couple different ways, factoring in a bunch of these covariates that we care about. So into our linear regression, we had a couple of potential covariates. So we included them: age, processing speed, and hearing level. And now we want to predict how well do people comprehend, again, in that sort of multi-speaker background we talked about earlier. And not shockingly, hearing levels are important for that. But then above and beyond that, we see a significant predictor of performance from that connection between those frontoparietal and language networks. But that's not the case for every cognitive network or selective attention network. So it's not just a greater overall brain connectivity, but it's a specific increase in connectivity between these frontoparietal and language networks. And this is not the case. Now this is another model for just sentence comprehension in that white noise background. So it's really that connectivity is significant when you're in this difficult environment. But in more of a simple environment, we don't see, age is marginally significant, but there's not a lot of brain connectivity prediction there. But it's in that selectively attention demanding resource, you see that connectivity being most significant. So can we capture these network effects behaviorally? If we want to study this, do we need to scan everyone's brain for half an hour? And the answer is we do see some interesting trends behaviorally. So this is data for just that sort of broadband white noise background. And hearing level predicts performance in there, which is not shocking. But we also have two measures here. One of working memory, the operation span task, and then the Simon task, which is a selective attention task. And what we see for the broadband noise, it's really sort of a combination of hearing and working memory abilities that predict performance. But now, as the boxes show, and that same pattern exists in silence. There's really no difference. But in a multi-speaker background, that's more like how we navigate everyday life, we see something different. We see, again, hearing plays a role, of course, and processing speed. But we also see that the selective attention task is a significant predictor. And that's not shocking because it's a selectively attention-demanding task. But also, I want to note that our sentence comprehension measure is of the performance on the non-canonical, the difficult sentences, compared to the simple sentences. So it's not just any type of speech perception in this surround, but it's how these difficult sentences are more difficult. And so it's not just a general perception measure, but how much does the increase in difficulty from the easy to the hard sentences occur, and that's predicted by this selective attention measure, but not the working memory measure.
What about the sign of the processing speed effect. Does that mean the slower you are, the better you do?
No, it's the faster. It's just how our sentence comprehension was scored. So no. So we have a couple weird effects like that, but that's not one of them. So just to summarize, in the neurotypical older adults, hearing loss plays a role in this interaction between selective attention and language networks. For example, there's stronger right Heschl gyrus functional connectivity with the cingulo-opercular network. There's stronger functional connectivity between the right inferior frontal gyrus and frontoparietal network. But then beyond the hearing effects, we see that stronger connectivity between bilateral ESTG areas and this frontoparietal network yield better sentence comprehension in these older adults. And also in a multi-speaker background, selective attention as well as hearing and processing speed are significant predictors of performance. But in that broadband or silence conditions, it's actually working memory that's driving it, not selective attention. So now what about after stroke? How can we use this information? And again, this is the work of my PhD student, Ariana. And the data I'll be presenting is from our initial group of about 25 patients with chronic aphasia. They've had aphasia for at least a year. They have a variety of lesion patterns and severities. It is a relatively mixed group. And we have a decent age range, age 28 to 80. The means about 50, and the majority of the subjects are in their 50s. And then we also have a matched control group, or at least as matched as we could get to, of 20 subjects. So we can kind of have a comparison of, what's the effect of, the aphasia and the stroke versus just the person's age or, other abilities. So as I mentioned before, common measures of selective attention clinically and experimentally in aphasia have yielded some sort of inconsistent results and have well-documented inconsistent results. And one of the most common tasks to use to measure selective attention is a Stroop task, which is sort of a simple version of it's presented here. And I'm sure you're all very familiar, but the idea is that you need to determine for each word what color the font is, and of course there's interference with the printed word. And while this is a really well-documented measure of selective attention, how well you don't get distracted by that conflicting information, it's maybe not necessarily the best way to measure selective attention that matters for patients with aphasia. And again, one of the problems is that selective attention is often only assessed in the visual modality, like a Stroop task, or some sort of combination of visual and auditory. In aphasia, there's auditory measures in typical adults, but not much of it's been translated into aphasia. And one way we kind of get around this is using the attention network test. And I don't want to waste time going through all the different machinations of it, but the idea is that it tests 3 different types of selective attention. One they call alerting, which I kind of think of as temporal selective attention. They give you a cue that what's important is about to happen in a few hundred milliseconds, so you know when to pay attention. And how well you can use that cue to your advantage is a measure of alerting. Orienting, I kind of think of as more of spatial selective attention. We give in the visual domain, it's an image appears in a point in space, and that's where the task you're about to do is going to happen. And then also, after those types of cues, there's also sort of more of kind of like a traditional Stroop task of executive kind of control, they call it, which I kind of think of as task-based selective attention. So you're given an instruction, like in a Stroop task, pay attention to the color of fonts, not what the word says. And in this task, we did this both in the auditory domain as well as the visual domain to compare. In the auditory domain, for example, it was the words spoken high and low in both a high and low voice. And we really wanted to know first, what does this look like in patients with aphasia? Are there modality differences? And the short answer is yes. Here I have on the x-axis auditory abilities, auditory measures for each of the 3, and then visual on the y. And whether you look at alerting or orienting or executive control, all these aspects of selective attention, there's really no correlation. So if you're like, what's going on here? The answer is we don't know. Well, we know that there's no significant correlation between the 2 modalities for our aphasia group for any of the 3 measures. Okay. This is particularly interesting in terms of the executive control measure. This is just the executive control I just showed you in our aphasia group. We think of that Stroop task as a sort of domain general ability to be able to take in an instruction and with that information inhibit certain parts of the stimulus and focus on others. But we, again, don't, and we should see a correlation if it was domain general, but we don't. And in our age-matched controls, we see something quite similar. We don't see a correlation between the two modalities, suggesting that although there's clearly probably domain general resources involved in this type of selective attention, but you can still have dissociations in the measures of those in older adults and also patients with aphasia. This isn't the case in young adults. We run a ton of young adults on the same tasks, so have many other labs, and you see a high correlation between performance in the executive control task, and that Stroop-like task, between the visual and auditory modalities. But we don't see that in our older adults and aphasia patients. So whether it be age-related changes or stroke-related changes, we see this dissociation in these abilities. Again, indicating that it's important to perhaps assess and quantify auditory selective attention compared to visual selective attention. Okay, so what predicts speech comprehension in relation to selective attention in our aphasia group? So we have a bunch of different things going on here in our model, and it's just how well is reaction time predicted for those difficult sentences. And of course, single word comprehension is an important covariate, right? If you have a patient with Wernicke's aphasia that doesn't understand, the words, that's going to really well predict how well they do on a sentence task. So that's understandable. But in addition, the only other measure, none of our working memory measures are significant predictors, but what is that orienting attention measure from the attention network test, which again, you can think of as paying attention to the right information at the right space. And then that's the only factor, again, not to the other subtypes of attention and not to the working memory measures. And just to kind of note, to load into this regression model, we looked at a variety of possible covariates to see what would correlate with sentence comprehension so that we could load it into our model. And again, of course, single word comprehension was significant, but we didn't see significant predictors in our stroke group with age or hearing level, or and other factors as well. But particularly this, hearing ability and age did not predict how well people did. And so that's interesting that it's really the sort of selective attention measure, of course, as in addition to single word comprehension. Just to compare to the age-matched control group, so sort of what is the effect of the stroke? Well, it's interesting. We get something a little bit different. We also, again, see a significant predictor of the selective attention orienting ability, but we also see that one of our working memory or short-term memory measures is a significant predictor. So in older adults, working memory seems to be more of a predictor, maybe a resource that's more engaged, but in our aphasic patients, of course, we didn't see that. And again, there was no significant correlation between any of these measures in our older adult group. For single word comprehension, of course, they're very high. That's why they're a control group. But age and hearing level did not affect their performance on this task. It was working memory and the orienting selective attention measure. So at least one type of selective attention is orienting. It's a significant predictor of sentence comprehension in aphasia. And then in the control group, both selective attention and short-term working memory tasks predict sentence comprehension. So we see this dissociation of sort of working memories strengthen the two groups. So now what we probably really want to know, and what, again, this is very preliminary, but how can we leverage this information to improve speech comprehension after stroke? And one possible way that we think is possible is through prosody manipulations of the speech. So as many of you in the room have conducted studies on this, so I'm sure everyone knows, but prosody can facilitate comprehension in neurotypical adults, right? So here again, we have on the left-hand side, simple sentences, and there's no difference between sort of typical sentence prosody. I say typical, but we exaggerated it a little bit, or talking like this. A monotone, regular type prosody. So it's regular intervals, but very different than the typical prosody you would hear. And regardless of prosody, for simple sentences, control subjects are quick and accurate, and there's no difference between the two prosody types. But when you get to more complex sentences, in this case, they were object-relative sentences, we see faster for the normal, slightly exaggerated sentence prosody compared to the list prosody. And this makes sense. We use prosodic cues to facilitate our sentence comprehension. And we've also seen, and again, many other studies have shown this as well, that if we look at functional MRI data of neurotypical adults, the brain regions that are specifically sort of tuned and more sensitive to changes in activation for each prosody type dissociate. For example, we've found that a portion of Broca's area is more sensitive to the sentence prosody information, whereas more posterior superior temporal regions are more activated by the Lisp prosody. And even my own studies that I've done have found slightly different dissociations, bringing in the anterior temporal lobe and additional posterior temporal regions. But the point is here that there's a steady stream of research showing that the two dissociate in the brain. So our hypothesis in aphasia is that sentence prosody probably improves comprehension by directing that listener's attention to critical parts of the sentence. So critical, sort of, for lack of a better term, syntactic information, but important information within a sentence. And so if you have intact selective attention resources, you can maximize the effectiveness of these cues. Okay? But if you don't, maybe some other type of prosody might be more helpful. And this part of our hypothesis is less well thought out, but nonetheless, it's our hypothesis, which is maybe a more regularly interval type prosody can improve auditory comprehension by engaging other resources. Maybe that temporal expectancy, if you know when the next unit is coming, might be helpful. And so our idea is that perhaps when selective attention is more impaired, other intact cognitive functions, perhaps working memory, can utilize this expectancy to benefit comprehension. So we've kind of tested this out in our aphasia group. So this is the same exact data I showed you a few minutes ago. These are just sentences, difficult sentences with normal sentence prosody. And again, it's a little exaggerated when we went back and listened to the stimuli. And again, so I just showed you this before. Of course, single word comprehension is a predictor in our aphasia group, but also the selective attention, this orienting ability. But now let's look at what happens when we look at Lisp prosody. Okay. So that's this bottom half here. And so now something different happens. We see that one of our working memory measures is a significant predictor of comprehension. In addition to, and in addition to a different type of selective attention, that executive control. This is actually kind of odd. I know it's hard to follow all the numbers, but actually it's the case that people that have less executive control do better. So this is one of those odd findings. But there's reason to believe that perhaps in older adults, as many of our aphasia group members are, this may not be the best measure. So the main thing I'm focusing on here is that with sentence prosody, orienting attention predicts comprehension, but with Lisp prosody, working memory abilities do instead. And just to look at the possible covariates we could have loaded into the model, for sentence prosody, like I mentioned before, really single word comprehension was the only predictor. And again, same thing with the Lisp prosody. Age doesn't have an effect on comprehension, either prosody, neither does hearing ability and some other measures. Just to compare to the control group, because maybe this is an aging effect, not an aphasia stroke effect. In our control group, like I just showed you before, it's really a combination of working memory and selective attention that predicts performance for sentence prosody. And now let's look in the Lisp prosody. And we actually don't find anything a significant predictor. The working memory gets kind of close, but we don't see anything that's significant. And it could be just our sample size, and maybe that would kind of come out eventually, but more likely that neurotypical older adults are able to compensate in a variety of ways for this sort of altered different prosody. And again, none of these possible covariates significantly predicted comprehension in either prosody. So to summarize our aphasia and prosody findings, selective attention performance varies between what type of selective attention you're looking at and what modality you're assessing in. And for sentences with normal prosody, the selective attention orienting aspect seems to be a significant predictor of sentence comprehension, but not working memory. And then for sentences with this more regular interval, we call it list-like prosody. Working memory is a significant predictor and not selective attention. So just a quick overall summary and sort of future directions. I keep talking about how selective attention is really sort of this underexplored sentence comprehension resource. There's not as much work as compared to, say, working memory, but our research and others show that it's clearly an important thing to investigate after stroke. We know that there's connectivity, significant connectivity between selective attention networks and Heschl's gyrus, as well as posterior STG bilaterally. We also see increases with hearing loss and connectivity of these networks supporting selective attention. So that's a variable we need to account for. And we also see that, again, increases in frontal-parietal connectivity with the language networks yields better sentence comprehension, even once hearing is controlled for. In typical aging, we see that selective attention and working memory predict sentence comprehension. But in aphasia, it's actually selective attention that predicts sentence comprehension abilities, again, for the normal prosody. And then this prosody element is still something we're just beginning to explore, but we think it's a promising avenue for thinking about, long-term, or the big goal of improving speech comprehension based on the cognitive profile of a stroke patient. So knowing what their cognitive strengths and weaknesses are, what would they best benefit from, either clinically or even just adaptive in their home environment. And the sort of bigger picture that I often work off of is trying to build some sort of model that allows us to map on sentence comprehension abilities onto different types of environments in which they occur, what type of cognitive functions are being involved, and then what brain networks are supporting those cognitive functions. So I'm not saying any of this is right, but I'm trying to build a model that allows us to test empirically using neuroimaging and behavioral measures what cognitive resources are really necessary for sentence comprehension in a variety of environments. Thank you. People that give me money, thank you. And thank you for listening.
Thank you so much. We'll take questions from the room first. And for the online audience, if you have questions, please put them in the chat box and I will read them out to Corianne.
Thank you.
I had a question about the monotone prosody condition. So as we've talked about this, we did a study on garden path processing, also using a condition where we had monotone prosody. I noticed when you gave the example that you had breaks between the words, so which makes it really staccato, which is a little bit different from what we did when we did have running speech, just without a notable intonation pattern. And I was just wondering whether that might add a level of complexity, actually, so making it more. It seems to me more difficult to listen to the words as they're really broken up, because you almost have to start over every time again, right?
Yeah, that's an important point. So our work on the prosody was really motivated by Derek and others' work looking at garden path sentences. So we just looked at a different type of complexity in sentences. But I didn't realize that distinction, so thank you. So yeah, we had, I don't remember the interval now, but we inserted, we created that list-like prosody by having each word recorded separately and then concatenating and inserting silence. So it is quite different than if it was continuous. And I do think that adds a level of difficulty. We controlled for the amplitude of each word, the beginning of an utterance tends to be louder. So we manipulated that. But I do think it's a good point. And I actually think continuous would be better. But I think it's always been something on our mind. We like the idea of having something that we could quantify, that we can make sure that was regular. But now that we see, even just from descriptions of our patients, that sort of abruptness almost is difficult. But for some people, it actually improves their comprehension. So perhaps that increases vigilance or something like that too. But it's a great point, and it's something we're kind of hoping to look into soon.
Thanks, Corianne. That was great. One of the things, maybe you showed it, I think I just missed it, to explore the data, trying regressing out the single word comprehension out of the sentence comprehension and looking at the residuals and how they correlate with the working memory.
Oh, with the
correlate, right?
yes, and oh, I'm very sorry. Sorry, I didn't do that. To the world, Julius asked if I had looked at regressing out single word comprehension and looking at the residuals and if they're correlated with working memory. So yes, and they do. But for the normal sentence prosody for that model, it's actually, but attention is a stronger predictor of the residuals than working memory. So it's not that working memory isn't engaged or isn't, lingering and critical, but it could be that selective attention, which we know is a precursor to a lot of working memory skill, might be really, my hypothesis is that it might be more driving the effect than working memory per se.
We have an online question from Kirana Tsapkini, who wonders whether there is any theoretical framework binding different types of attention, such as orienting or alerting or executive control or whatever anyone would like to add. Is there such a framework?
Is there a framework? Can you repeat the question one more time? The beginning part of it.
Is there any theoretical framework binding different types of attention, such as orienting or alerting or executive control or whatever anyone would like to add?
Yes. So there's a wonderful, rich literature looking at selective attention sort of in and of itself, for lack of a better term, looking at the relationship between orienting and alerting and executive control. Some of it's in the auditory domain, but not very much comparatively to the visual domain. So it's not necessarily, we have to do a little bit more groundwork in the auditory domain to know how to apply it in terms of aphasia. But we do see there's some evidence that orienting and alerting are correlated with executive control, as they might help improve executive control. But there's in aphasia, there's not a huge framework, but outside of that, in neurotypical adults, there's lots of models showing that these three networks dissociate in the brain, but they can also be related in performance. So there's a lot of unknowns, I would say, though, in the auditory domain for how these are related. It's a poor answer, but it's the best I have off the top of my head.
I have a question. I think it's really interesting because you don't see a lot of work on comprehension. But as a therapist, I'm thinking, what are the implications for treatment? And so are the implications that maybe we need to do more selective attention work with folks as we're working on comprehension? Do we need to introduce more visual and auditory? What are your thoughts on clinical implications?
Yeah, so first of all, I'm not an SLP, so I rely upon their insights, all the time. So forgive me if something I say is like, that's not irrelevant to my clients. Oh, the question was, as a clinician, as an SLP, what are some implications for my work? Should we be focusing on visual and auditory attention? Should we do selective attention work or other directions? And of course, this is very preliminary work. So, but the idea is that we would hope to find ways in which to deliver the therapy that would maximize an individual's cognitive abilities. So down the road, the idea is, and a couple of grant submissions from now, if there a bunch of data is collected, to be able to say, okay, if a patient has impaired selective attention versus working memory in a couple different domains, this is how to best maximize that speech signal to them. And then we was talking with Dirk earlier, is that it's not that then everyone in the world needs to speak to them in that manner, but perhaps that's something you could taper off into normal speech, for example. But of course, this is still preliminary work. But I do think even our preliminary work suggests, of course, more work is needed, but this idea that, selective attention or attention can be measured in one domain and it predicts another does not seem to be the case for older adults and patients with aphasia.
We have another online question from Diana. A similar question to the one just posed. How do you think these models that you are working on are relevant to treatment for working memory training?
This is a very good question. So there's lots of work that's not mine that shows that selective attention can be a foundation or a precursor to working memory, right? If you want to think about something in your head over and over again and keep it in your sort of mind space, you need to first attend to that information correctly, not other information, and then sort of bring that into your working memory, for lack of a better term. And so we know these two processes are linked, and that selective attention is sort of a precursor for working memory abilities. So it would be my inclination to say that working memory would benefit from selective attention work as well. But of course, that's not been clinically, I'm not a clinician, but our idea is that perhaps all these relationships we've seen clinically and in the literature between working memory and communication and speech comprehension abilities, perhaps is driven by these selective attention abilities, maybe through working memory, but it's the selective attention that might be driving this relationship. So it'd be worth addressing. But again, these are, early stages.
Have another one from Lorraine Obler. When you say selective attention is a significant predictor of comprehension linked to an increase in the frontoparietal network, do you mean the frontotemporal network bilaterally or in the left hemisphere?
Oh, that's a very good question. So we actually found that there was the greater connectivity was within the left hemisphere. We saw a trend in the right, but it was that greater connectivity between sort of the posterior STG in the left hemisphere and the left frontal parietal network. But we know these networks are bilateral, so and they communicate across hemispheres, but the significant correlations we found were in the left hemisphere.
That seems to be it for the online questions.
One more really quick. Can you tell us a little bit about how you deal with lesions in your network analysis in the left hemisphere?
Right. Sure. So can you tell me a little bit, can I tell you a little bit about how we deal with the lesion in the functional connectivity analyses? So as a reminder, the functional connectivity analyses I showed you were in the older adults. So and the answer for the talk is I didn't, because I don't show you functional connectivity data for the lesion space. We have the resting state. So the practical future direction is right now my graduate students are looking at the brain data. We have resting state fMRI data on these folks, as well as of course lesion mapping procedures and DTI as well. And answer is I don't really know. I sent my graduate student Ariana out here to work with Chris's personnel to get some ideas about how to do that with your pipeline, but I don't know yet is the answer. As a first stab, we've just looked at the opposite hemisphere as sort of a cheat. We just looked at right hemisphere connectivity in these regions, but we haven't looked at the left hemisphere yet.
No other questions from the room. Thank you very much. It was great.
Thank you. Thank you for listening.